Welcome to the second of 12 EMOS webinars this year. My name is Mojca Baudaš. I'm from the University of Ljubljana, where this session is hosted. I'm responsible for this year's series of webinars, and today I'll also act as a facilitator. Now, EMOS, for those that maybe don't know yet, stands for the European Master in Official Statistics. It's a joint project of universities and data producers in the EU member states, EFTA and EU candidate countries. The network now comprises 23 master programs in 15 countries, so many of you are coming from these countries. But this network is expected to grow soon, as the third call for applications is about to be launched in March, and you have this announcement also here on the slide. So today's participants are coming from EMOS and other universities, central banks, NSIs, and other governmental entities. And as you can see, from all around the world nearly. If your university is interested in applying for the EMOS label, or if you, as a producer or user of official statistics, would like to contribute to the EMOS network, please consider attending the workshop in Ljubljana on the 6th of March this year. Okay, now let me explain briefly how we run the webinar today. As a participant, you can watch and listen to the session. But to interact with the presenter or me, you can use the chat window on the right. We encourage you to post questions to the presenter here throughout the webinar. So whenever a question pops to your mind, just write down in the chat, and we'll have short breaks during the presentation to answer these questions. Should you have any technical question, please use the help desk window at the bottom right of the screen, and we'll try to help as well. Now, today I have a great pleasure to host Aurel Schubert, Director General of the European Central Bank's Statistics Department. Aurel holds a PhD in economics from the University of South Carolina and a master's degree in business administration from the Vienna University of Economics and Business. He initially worked at the National Bank of Austria. Today, he is also chairman of the Statistics Committee of the European System of Central Banks, chairman of the Contact Group on Data on the European Systemic Risk Board, co-chair of the European Statistical Forum, and vice chairman of the Irving Fisher Committee on Central Bank Statistics. Now, to tell you a little bit more about the prospects, Aurel recently announced his colleagues at the ECB that he decided to rebalance his private and professional life in favor of the first one. He will take up his duties as honorary professor of economics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and might also return to his hobby of economic and financial history. Thus, he's coming from the data producer to our data user side. And to paraphrase Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, this is a small step for the ECB Directorate General Statistics, but a big leap for him. Now, Aurel will leave in a moment where the statistical function will continue to further develop towards an increasingly decision-making policy driven by data, and he will continue to share his long professional experience with others, especially students. So, welcome to academia, Aurel. Now, if we move to the presentation slides, in our first webinar, we demystified the functioning of the European statistical system. In the second one, we'll look at statistics in the European system of central banks. Aurel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mojca, and good afternoon for all those in Europe, and good morning for those which I see from Mexico. So what I want to do in the next hour or so is, she said, demystify the European system of central banks' role in statistics. As you might already know, or maybe not yet, there are two statistical systems in Europe, two European statistical systems. One, which you already heard about a few weeks ago, the European statistical system, which is a partnership of the National Statistical Institutes with Eurostat as the coordinator and the top, and the second one, the European System of Central Banks, with the ECB as a coordinator at the center of the system. And so today I will talk about the second European statistical system, namely that of the central banks. So I'll just what I want to do is basically tell you something about the functions. What are we doing? What are the data needs? Moitz already mentioned that there is a data-driven decision making. So what are the data needs of the policymakers? What are the legal bases on which we are doing our work? How do we produce this? We produce it as a system. I'll come back to that. How is the cooperation with the other European statistical system, the ESS, the European Statistical System? What are the main statistical products which we do as central banks? And also, what is the way forward? In which direction is the statistics in the central banking community going? Last but not least, also as a service, can you get access to these data? So that's what I'm planning to do. Here I just start lightly with the three buildings of the ECB here in Frankfurt, and on the top right you see a red brick building. That's where statistics is located in the ECB here downtown Frankfurt. Now, so what are the functions of the European Central Bank or the Eurosystem? And I'll come back in a moment what Eurosystem means concretely for those who might not be familiar with it. So first and foremost, the function is to ensure, as a monetary policy, ensure price stability. So define and implement the monetary policy. And we'll come back in a moment. What kind of data do we need for monetary policy? The second big block of tasks is financial stability and banking supervision. So both macro financial stability, but also micro banking stability. So banking supervision and financial stability. And then there is another part, which is payment systems. So ensuring or promoting the smooth operation of payment systems. So all these functions require data for their decision making, and I will dwell much more on this aspect in the next 45 minutes. Maybe just quickly on the decision making bodies that you're familiar. On the top of the ECB is the so-called Governing Council. That's the main decision making body of the ECB. So this is the decision making body who will also, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, decide on any statistical projects which the Eurosystem is doing. So it consists of the 6 members of the executive board of the ECB, you will see them in a moment, plus all the governors of all the central banks that are participating in the euro, so currently 19 euro area countries. Then there is the executive board, which consists of the president, the vice president, and 4 more members. Those who are actually running the show on a day-to-day basis. So they are continuously here in Frankfurt, and they are implementing whatever the Governing Council decides, and they are proposing to the Governing Council whatever the Governing Council decides. Then there is the General Council, which now for our purposes is not so important, where all the governors of all EU central banks are represented. But since many of them are not part of the common monetary policy, they don't decide on monetary policy. And the last body that's now important since 2014, that's the supervisory board, those who are supervising the banks. And here, the supervisory board is also relevant, which when I come back to banking statistics. It's not a decision-making body, but it's again a decision preparation body. Now here is just the Governing Council. That's the Governing Council room. And as I said, the Governing Council is the one body that decides and adopts the guidelines. So all legal acts for statistics are coming through the Governing Council. So that is very important. We don't collect any statistics without a legal act. And this is the executive board with the president, vice president, and 4 other members. And this lady, the only lady here, is also in charge of statistics. So they are really running the institution on a day-to-day basis. And this is the supervisory board, or the ECB members of the supervisory board. These 5 are the ECB members. And then you have the national supervisors from the different euro area countries, all those who are participating in the common banking supervision, in the so-called single supervisory mechanism. So these are the important bodies for our decision making, for all the statistics which we are producing. We need, so to speak, the consent of these bodies. So that's very different from the European statistical system, which you heard about, because there it's the European Parliament or the European Council who makes regulations. But here, the ECB has the power from the treaty on the European functioning of the European Union to decide on the own statistics, on those statistics which we need as central bank. And here you just have this article that the European Central Bank, together with the national central banks of the member states whose currency is the euro, they are the Eurosystem. And that's the area for which we are producing statistics. And here you see the map with the 19 euro area countries and the national central banks. So the national central banks of the 19 countries plus the ECB, that is the so-called the Eurosystem, which is here the relevant institutional body for our purposes. So now I want to go a little bit into the data needs. So you know now the decision-making structures, the decision-making bodies, but what are the data needs? And now again, we come back to the different policy areas. Now the first, as I said, is monetary policy. So the law says the ECB is in charge of the monetary policy for the euro area, and the monetary policy has one goal, namely to ensure a price stability. And in order to make the decisions on monetary policy, the governing council needs data. We have what we call evidence-based policy making. But there is lots of economic data out there, so you need to create a certain structure. And the structure is, we have the so-called economic analysis and the monetary analysis. So we group together all the economic data. These are all those data about the economy that give an indication in the short term on potential price pressures. You remember monetary policy has to ensure price stability. And the monetary analysis is more the longer term, the developments of money supply, the developments of credits. And this kind of information is being looked at regularly. Every 6 weeks, the governing council makes a decision on monetary policy. And if you ever listen to the press conferences of the president, you will always hear that he refers first to the monetary analysis, first to the economic analysis, then to the monetary analysis, and then talks about the cross-checking of the information. So this full set of information, which is about 120 pages of tables and graphs, that is something we produce regularly for the governing council decisions, as I said, every 6 weeks when the governing council decides on monetary policy. So here it's important, the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, you have at the bottom the goal, namely to ensure price stability, as a low inflation rate. And on the top you have the instrument, which is the interest rate, the central bank interest rate. And then you have the transmission. How is the policy of the central bank transmitted towards prices? And so you have here the different boxes like money and credit, which I referred to before in the monetary analysis, asset prices, bank interest rates, exchange rates. So for all these boxes which are relevant in the transmission of monetary policy, you need data. You have to know how is money and credit developing, how are asset prices developing, how are bank interest rates developing, or how are wages and prices developing, how is supply and demand of goods, or how is the labor market developing. So for all these boxes, the governing council, for its decision making, needs statistics and needs data. And now, initially, as I said, was only monetary policy. Now, through the crisis, so the last 10 years of financial crisis, new tasks were given to the ECB. And with these new tasks came new demands for data. And the most important two new tasks, which I want to refer to, was from 2010-2011, where Europe created new supervisory structures, among them the so-called ESRB, the European Systemic Risk Board, which is in charge of macro-prudential stability, which is supposed to look at risks, macroeconomic, macro-financial risks, They started to work in late 2010 or since 2011, and we have to supply all the data for this macroprudential supervisory body. And then in 2014, as you might see here on the graph, in 2014, the ECB was in charge with banking supervision for the large European banks, currently about 130 banking groups which are directly supervised by the ECB. And again, we were made in charge of all the data supply for banking supervision. So since late 2014, we are collecting from all the banks the supervisory data, so-called COREP, FINREP, so data on their balance sheets, data on their profit and loss accounts, data on their liquidity positions, etc., etc. So to wrap this all up, before I give you the chance, first chance to ask questions, is that we have now basically three big tasks as ECB and as a Eurosystem, as central banks, namely monetary policy. Then, as you see in the right bottom, macroprudential policies, as all those to ensure the overall stability of the financial system. And at the lower left, you see banking supervision for the largest banks. So we got new responsibilities, both on the macro and microprudential side. And what really came out in the crisis, and that's very crucial for what I will be saying maybe in 20, 25 minutes, when I talk about future data needs, what it turned out in the crisis is that there is an enormous heterogeneity in the euro area. So the countries, there are large differences between countries. There are large differences between sectors in the countries. So for instance, the banking sector in certain countries, you have very strong, good banks, but you also have very weak banks. So you have differences, you have imbalances, you have heterogeneities, which means that the average numbers which we use to produce the aggregates are no longer enough. Markets are fragmented, and financial instruments turned out to be very complex. So for all these, and I'll come back to that later, we need in the future much more granular data, and we have to move away from just collecting aggregates, which are basically averages. So that is basically to set the frame. Why are we and for what purposes are we collecting statistics and producing statistics in the Eurosystem? So I'm happy if you have any questions right away. Otherwise, I would continue with my presentation.
Yes, I would just like to encourage participants to pose questions, and we do have one question from Mitya from Slovenia. Do you also collect data on financial derivatives?
Mm-hmm. Financial derivatives, actually, it is an EU regulation, the so-called EMIR regulation, European Markets Infrastructure Regulation, which is the legal basis for the collection of derivatives data. So it is collected via the so-called trade repositories, and ESMA, the European Security and Markets Authority in Paris, is in charge of it. But we get access to the data, and we are actually, for these ESRB purposes, which I just mentioned, for this European Systemic Risk Board, which is very interested in this data. So we are working very much with this EMIR data to make it available, especially to the ESRB. And also the national central banks have access to the data which reflects their country or which is related to their specific country. So we are not collecting it ourselves, but we have access to it, and it is a big project for us to make access to that, because there we are talking about 100 to 200 million data points per day. So these are really big data.
So it's a single source, and national authorities just access parts of this one single data source.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, I think, we have another question. What is the role, the relationship of national central banks towards ECB? But I guess this will be part of the later section, so we'll come back to this question. Now let's just proceed to the next section.
So thank you very much. Now a few words on the legal basis. As I said, all what we do has to be based on a legal act of the ECB. So the legal basis you have at the top, you have the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And based on that, you have then the famous you have the statutes of the ECB, and the statutes of the ECB in Article 5 give the ECB the powers to collect statistics or data for statistics for its own policy purposes. And that is very, very important. So there is a council regulation, so-called 2533 from 98, which gives the ECB the powers to collect data from what is the financial sector. So we are allowed, and that it specifies other things, also the principles, etc. But that's the basis on which we can then adopt our own legal acts. And then we come with these ECB regulations. These are those legal acts which are directly applicable to the reporting agents. And so here you have a list, which I have here. For instance, investment funds, we have a regulation which is directly addressing all investment funds in the euro area. So all investment funds in the euro area have to report whatever we say to the ECB, like on a monthly basis. Or we have a regulation on insurance corporations. We have a regulations on MFIs, so the monetary financial institutions, so basically the banks. And I don't want to go into all the details, but we have these regulations. So these are the legal basis for us for collecting data. But, and that comes back to the one question which was just asked by Estrelita, if I see it correctly. What's the role of the national central banks? We, as ECB, we don't collect the data ourselves. It is collected via the national central banks. So all this statistical work is a joint effort of the team of the system of the national central banks and the ECB. So the national central banks collect from their national banks, from their national as a commercial banks, from the national investment funds, from the national insurance corporations, or from their national pension funds in the future. So they collect the data from there. They do quality checking and then forward the data to us, to the ECB. But for them to know what and when to forward data to us, we have what you have that at the right side here, so-called guidelines. The ECB guidelines are the rules what the national central banks have to do relative to us. So when do they have to send the data, in what format, in what kind of templates, etc. This is then fixed in guidelines. So here you have the list again, regulations, they give direct obligations to report to the reporting agents. So you don't need any national legal act here in between. And the guidelines tell then what the national central banks who are collecting the data from the reporting agents, what they have to do so that we get the data. And then as we are also interested in data from non-Euro area EU countries, but there we don't have any legal powers. We have something what is called recommendations. So for instance, if in some countries the balance of payments is collected not by the central bank, but the Statistical Institute, then we can make a recommendation. Or to those countries who are not in the Euro area where we're still interested in data, we can do a recommendation. But that's not so important now for our purposes here today. So what is now important is that the ECB and the Eurosystem has two roles in the area of statistics. It's on the one side a big user, and I just mentioned before, the economic analysis, the monetary analysis. So it is a power user. It needs lots of data for its decision making, but at the same time, the European system of central banks, or the Eurosystem as we call it, is also a big producer of statistics. So we are on both sides, so to speak, of the game. Now here, what kind of data do we produce? Here, first of all, as I mentioned already, it's monetary and financial statistics. So that is really the core of it. So we are producing European statistics on monetary aggregates, for instance. So how much money is there? Credit aggregates. So these are the monetary financial statistics. I come later to more details here. The second big block is external statistics. That's also something traditionally in most European countries central banks are doing as a balance of payments, an international investment position. So balance of payments are the flows, external trade in goods and services, financing, cross-border financing. So that's balance of payments. The international investment position are then the stocks. The external debt, the external assets, so the stocks to it. Then a big area which has been grown enormously in the last few years in importance is securities, because more and more financing happens not directly through bank loans, but through securities. So securities are now very important. They were also very important in the financial crisis. If you remember, for instance, government securities of certain governments, for instance, maybe losing value. So the question was very quickly, who owns those securities, who might lose if those securities lose value. So security is an important area. The fourth big area is quarterly euro area accounts, where we really make the financial side of GDP, so to speak. You have the real economy and you have the financing of the real economy. That's something we are extremely interested. That shows us who is financing whom in the economy. So very important for a central bank. And then we have a few other statistics. I'll come back to those which we are producing. And then since 2014, since we have now these supervisory tasks in the ECB, we also produce supervisory data, especially on those 130 consolidated banking groups which are directly supervised from the ECB. So this is the part where we are producing and we are making it available to our policymakers. But our policymakers also need other information than what we produce, and we don't want to duplicate anything in Europe. That's why I said in the very beginning, we have these two European statistical systems, so we take a lot of data from our colleagues in the European statistical system. For instance, all the what we call real economy data, we don't produce it. We are focusing on the financial economy. Eurostat and the national statistical institutes are focusing on the real economy, so GDP, inflation rate, labor market, short-term business statistics. These things are collected by Eurostat from the national statistical institutes, and we import those and put it at the disposal of our analysts and our decision-making bodies. So this is also very, very important. So this, what I mentioned very early, this economic analysis, the first pillar of the analysis, mainly comes from the European statistical system, while we produce mainly the monetary analysis part. But we also use international statistics. You know, we are not an island in Europe, so we use data from the BIS. We also deliver data to the BIS. We use also data from the IMF, from the OECD, from the World Bank. So we are also using others, and we are contributing to what is known in the G20 context, principal global indicators. So again, here we are on both sides. And in addition, very, very important is commercial data providers. So not for every financial phenomenon that is out there in the market are we immediately collecting data. If there is data collected by the private sector, which we can buy, think about the Reuters, the Bloombergs, the Bureau van Dijks, then if it's useful for our purposes, we are buying this commercial data and put it at the disposal of our analysts and decision-making bodies. So this is where you see what kind of information and where does the information come from and what kind of information are we producing. And then when we talk about producing, then the question, and that leads again to what's the role of national central banks? How are we producing? What is the production process? And it is very important, as I said, we in the ECB here in Frankfurt, we are not collecting the data ourselves. We are using the national central banks, or in the supervisory area, the so-called national competent authorities, which usually, in most cases, is the central bank at the same time. But what is very crucial is, in order to produce European statistics, so produce data on the euro area for decision making, the inputs you get from the different countries, those inputs have to be harmonized. So what is absolutely crucial is the harmonization. And here, that is the important role of the ECB, and I'll come back in a second to the so-called statistics committee, which Moisa mentioned, which I'm chairing. That is where we do the harmonization, because yes, we always had money supply numbers in the different countries, but once you looked into the details 20 years ago, you found enormous differences in how they are computed, what are the definitions behind it. So what we have to do, and it's a large part of our work, is to harmonize those data concepts before we start the collecting those. And that is important here. So then the actual collection happens through the national central banks, and we and the ECB here, we do then the cross-country quality assurance. And then after the quality assurance, we compile euro area aggregates and put it at the disposal of the decision makers. And very important also, we publish most of this data because this is also a public good. So we are not only producing it for our own purposes, we are also publishing it to the analysts, to the world at large, mainly through the internet, so that we are also very transparent in that. And then there is, as I said, there is also a shared task where national central banks and the ECB are involved. For instance, in the balance of payments committee of the IMF, we have both national central banks represented, but also the ECB represented, or in some other European and international bodies where we are both sharing those tasks. But what is important is, as I said before, we are not an island in Europe. So the concepts, the methods, the methodologies we use, we try to be aligned as much as possible with international standards. So for the balance of payments, the basis for us is the balance of payments manual, currently the 6th edition. Or for national accounts, we have the system of national accounts of the UN and the European version, which is the European System of Accounts 2010. Or also for government finance statistics, monetary financial statistics, we are always trying to align ourselves to international standards wherever they exist. So that is very, very important. So we don't, so that the data at the end of the day from Europe is as much as possible comparable for the data from other big economic areas in the world. Now, compiling euro area aggregates is sometimes very easy, but sometimes rather complicated. It's not just summing up the national data. Sometimes, yes, I mean, if you think, but that's not our task, like unemployment. Okay, you add up the unemployed in the different countries divided by the labor force of the overall area, then you get an unemployment number for the euro area. But if you think about a balance of payments, you have national balance of payments, which are, for instance, the German balance of payments is the trade and the financial transactions between Germany and the rest of the world, so 105 other countries in the world or so. That's the German. But the German contribution to the euro area balance of payments, there you have to exclude anything that's within the euro area. Any trade between Germany and France or France and Austria, that's within the euro area. So for a euro area balance of payments, you only need the part which the countries have in trade, in goods and services and financial trade with the rest of the world outside of the euro area. So this is not that easy a task. It is quite a complicated. And if you think about the money supply or the balance sheets of the banks, again, you have to take out any transactions between a German bank and a Portuguese bank. It's inside the euro area. So it's not relevant in that context if you want to look at what is with the rest of the world. So again, here, so we have to compute what we call then a consolidated balance sheet of the banking sector, and you cannot just simply add up the national numbers. There's not the time today to get in any technical specificities here, but this is not a trivial task. And then important is all the quality controls. And here we at the ECB have the possibility to do cross-country quality controls. Every national central bank can do quality controls within its country, within the jurisdiction, but we can do it then across countries and see, are there strange developments in one country relative to the other countries, and then we can start asking questions and improve the quality. So the decision-making bodies, I mentioned already, the governing council is at the top, the executive board is at the top, but for statistical purpose, crucial is this third here, the ESCB Statistics Committee, which I'm chairing, where all the national central banks are represented, and that's where this whole harmonization work and developing of legal acts takes place. So this is the strategic body that steers the statistics of the ESCB. So it's comparable to the European Statistical System Committee, which you might have heard about the last time. So here we have the so-called ECB Statistics Committee. But we are more, we say, the strategic body. The real actual work and the expert work happens in these working groups. And here you see we have currently 9 working groups being for all the different domains in our statistical production, be it financial accounts, be it monetary financial statistics, be it supervisory statistics, or for instance, external statistics. So for all these areas, that is where the experts come together. So a working group, you have to think they meet between 2 and 5 times a year. So they prepare everything, all the legal acts, but they also prepare the quality controls, and all new topics, new developments are discussed and prepared there. And then the statistics committee, which meets about 4 times a year normally, that's there when we basically give the final touches on it before it moves on to the executive board and the governing council for decision making. So that is basically
Aurel?
how we work. Yes.
Yes, Aurel, we have one question that you probably already addressed a little bit. Could you elaborate a little more on how the harmonization process is implemented? So I would guess that most of the harmonization work is done in these working groups.
Yeah, now that's where the harmonization happens, so to speak, in theory, and where it is put down in a legal act or in guidelines or in manuals, in handbooks. But then the implementation is happening. There it's clear then what kind of work has to be done locally, in the quality control. And then we check, obviously, at the ECB level whether it has been implemented the way it is. Yes, but the harmonization work happens in the working groups where we discuss until we come to a common agreement in the working group. And then the working group makes a proposal to the statistics committee where there might be still some discussions, there might still be some bargaining there. So if you take, for instance, here unaccredited working group, which is here the 4th, and I'll come back later on to unaccredited a little bit more in detail. But that was a very long discussion. So unaccredited stands for a credit register, to simplify. The credit register of all loans to companies in Europe. So we are talking about maybe potentially 50 million loans, which we will get from the end of this year on. We had years of discussion of what should be collected, from whom, should there be a threshold or not? Because the problem was many countries had already credit registers before, but they were completely unharmonized. So they addressed different reporting agents, they had different thresholds, they were asking for different variables, etc. So this harmonization work happens first of all by the experts in the working groups, and then there is a final check and discussion in the statistics committee, and that's how it's happening. Yes.
Okay, at the moment we have to go on because time is running, and I'll collect the questions for the final discussion.
Okay, then quickly, as we said, there are these 2 European statistical systems. The one on the left side you heard already, that is the European Statistical System, the National Statistical Institutes. On the right side you have the ESCB. As I mentioned, is Article 5 of our statutes. This is the Europeans. And it's important that we cooperate. So between the 2, we have a so-called memorandum of understanding. And actually, as we are sitting here, a few floors downstairs, the CMFB is meeting, which is the Committee on Monetary, Financial and Balance of Payments Statistics, which is the coordinating body, technical coordinating body between the 2 statistical pillars. And above it, there is a statistical you call European Statistical Forum, which is more the strategic body where the heads of the national statistical institutes and the heads of statistics of the central banks meet once a year. Again, a body which I'm co-chairing together with Mariana Kotseva, you might have heard 2 weeks ago. So we are co-chairing this. We give the strategic guidance for the cooperation, and the actual operational cooperation takes place in the context of this so-called CMFB. So important is we don't have any overlaps, but we also don't have gaps in the economic statistics. And so very simplified speaking, the European statistical system is primarily responsible for general economic statistics for our purposes. They are also doing environmental statistics, social statistics, but for our purposes, they are in charge of general economic statistics, while we are in charge of the financial sector, of what you call monetary financial statistics, international investment reserves, effective exchange rates, etc. And there is a part which is a shared responsibility because the balance of payments has both a real part and a financial part. So in this area, we have to cooperate very strongly. So for instance, topics of these cross-cutting transversal issues, which they are discussing just a few floors below me, is for instance the macro imbalances procedure scoreboard, where some statistics come from central banks, some statistics come from statistical institutes, or the question, for instance, of infrastructure like legal entity identifier. This will be a topic which we'll discuss tomorrow. Or how does globalization affect both of our statistics? Again, something where we are together in the same boat, and so we have to discuss this together. So what are now the main statistical products of the central banks? First of all, the core of a central bank is obviously money. So all the statistics on money, so monetary financial institution statistics, financial market statistics, so monetary aggregates. You might have heard of M1, M2, M3. What are the counterparts? So how is money created? So the credit behavior, the loans. Then interest rates. How is the policy of the ECB transmitted to the retail bank customers? So how are interest rates for loans or deposits moving? Investment funds are getting more and more important. Insurance corporations. So since last year, we have very detailed, harmonized insurance statistics. Pension fund statistics, hopefully, no, it was just approved. It will be published in the next 2 weeks. So from next year on, we will collect pension fund statistics on the largest pension funds in Europe. So this kind of data on the financial market. The second area, as I mentioned, is external statistics, so balance of payments, international investment position, including international foreign reserves. So we have a monthly balance of payments, we have a quarterly balance of payments, we have the international investment position, so the stocks and the flows, and we also have statistics on the nominal and the real effective exchange rate of the euro. And we have a lot of also geographical breakdown for these things. The third big area I mentioned already is euro area accounts. So the euro that we really want to have the economic developments of the euro area, but also all the financial developments which are financing the economy. So we have the whole economy broken down by the institutional sectors, the financial sector, the non-financial corporations, the private households, the government, and the rest of the world, which is de facto, so to speak, comes from the balance of payments. So we have the different sectors, who is financing whom, both in terms of stocks and in terms of flows. So this is very important information. It shows us how, for instance, the financing behavior of enterprises is developing over time, how much is bank financed, how much is market financed, etc. So this is very, very important information for monetary policy decision making. And it integrates, now in these euro accounts, we really integrate the monetary side, the financial statistics, and the economic statistics. So the real side with the financial side. And that allows a lot of interesting analysis. For instance, the indebtedness. Who is indebted to whom? And these are the questions which are for policy very, very important, especially in times which we had it in the last few years of crisis, of big changes in financing behaviors. So questions, do enterprises still have access to financing? Yes or no? And who is financing enterprises? These kind of questions you can answer from our euro area accounts. As I mentioned, with the extension of the tasks of the ECB, banking supervision came as a new task in 2014. So we are now collecting from these 130 consolidated banking groups, which is maybe about 1,200 to 1,300 individual banks. We are collecting from them balance sheet information, profitability information, capital adequacy information, also information on the quality of their assets, on their funding, on their liquidity. So these are all those important information which banking supervisors need. And again, we are not just collecting for the banking supervisors, we are also publishing aggregate information, not individual bank information, but aggregate information we are publishing. And this aggregate information is also very, very important for macroprudential purposes. And here we have started about a year and a half ago to publish a lot of data. As I mentioned, we also have this macroprudential task. There is this European Systemic Risk Board, which is composed of the central bank governors of the EU countries and of the supervisors, be it banking supervisor, insurance supervisor, or market supervisor. They come together 4 times a year to decide and discuss systemic risk issues. But again, for that, they need a lot of information. And behind those meetings, you have lots of working groups, task forces, which look into very specific questions. And again, for those specific questions, they need very specific data. So the main sources for this ESRB data is either it comes from the supervisory authorities, or it comes from us in-house, or also from commercial data providers, and also a lot of ad hoc surveys. So all this data is being put at the disposal of the ESRB in the so-called white book, and that is very important, and I'll show you on the next slide. Because if you look at the risks, you have to say what kind of risks should they look at. So what kind of risks exist in a market, in a financial market? So there are risks of interlinkages between institutions, there are risks to the profitability of institutions, there are liquidity funding risks, there are credit risks, your debtors might not pay back, there might be macroeconomic risk, and also market risk. So we have grouped all this information which we put at the disposal of the ESRB. We grouped this into these 6 different risk categories. And again, we not only put it at the disposal of the ESRB, we are also publishing it. So if you look at the homepage of the ECB or the ESRB, you will find those indicators grouped in these 6 risk categories, which we are producing regularly for the European Systemic Risk Board. So there has been, in the last few years, an enormous extension of data needs and data production. But we are not at the end yet. There are new data needs and new projects, and I will quickly go through those projects. But the challenge for us, for statistics, at least in central banks, is we have these increasing demands. I mentioned there is this heterogeneity, so we need much more detailed data, or the decision makers need more detailed data, which means individual country data or individual micro data on transactions, on positions, and distributional data. So behind the averages, what is the distribution? How do the tails look like? At the other side, we have a fatigue by our reporters, who always basically are the banks, the financial sector. The more you go granular, the more the questions of confidentiality become relevant. As long as we only got French aggregates or German aggregates, there was no question of confidentiality. Now we have individual bank data, or we have even individual loan by loan information. And our resources, unfortunately, are also limited. So what we do, we go now in the area of having more micro data, more granular data. So here you have a few of those which are already operational, where we really go now to individual institutions data, or individual transactions data, or individual positions data. And on the other side, we are developing new areas. And since the European economy is mainly still bank and bank loan finance, the next big project, which is almost ready, is this, what you have on the right-hand side on the top, this analytical granular credit and credit risk data set. So it's really a loan-by-loan database. This is this AnaCredit I mentioned before, which we are currently developing, which by the end of the year will bring us the first time real data on 50 or 60 million loans. We are very strong in the securities area already. So we have very much information, very granular information on all securities which are held in Europe. So we have a register of all securities, but we also know which sectors in Europe are holding which security. So there we are already very, very developed. Very crucial, on the third one on the right-hand side, is a register. For all this work, and the more you have these granular databases, you need a very strong register. So we are working on it and developing, and it's already very much developed, our so-called Register of Institutions Affiliates, or RIAD, where all financial institutions in Europe are in there with many, many different attributes. And in the future, also all the counterparts of the loans of this Anacredit, about 15 million enterprises, non-financial corporations, they will be all in this one register. So we really know all the institutions, and we know the interlinkages in ownership between the regulations. And the last one, I'll say a few words in a moment about this overnight rate. So very quickly, not going too much into the detail, what were the big projects or are the big projects now in the granular area? One is on the money market. So since last year, we are collecting every day about 45,000 transactions that happen in the money market, mainly between banks. So we have the 52 largest banks in Europe reporting every day what kind of money market transactions did they have the day before, with whom, at what interest rate, what security was involved. So this is very, very important granular data. It brings us now into the world of what we call usually quasi-big data. As I mentioned already, in the security area, we are very developed. We know all securities that were issued in Europe. We know in the meantime basically which sectors are holding all these securities. I don't want to go into any more detail, but again, here important that we have all the reference data. And then the Anacredit, what I mentioned, this is now really to get loan by loan information. As I mentioned, maybe 50, 60 million loans where we know Bank X has given a loan to company Y in this amount. Is it performing? Is it not performing? What interest rate, etc., etc. So there are about 88 attributes to every loan which we will receive. And then the big newest project is that we have been in charge to compute a benchmark interest rate, because in the money market, you might have heard, if you're from Europe, about Euribor, or if you're in London, you might have heard about LIBOR, and many other countries have their own money market benchmarks. The Euribor and the EONIA, the European benchmarks, are no longer very reliable because many of those are not based on actual transactions but on reported prices. So now the ECB has the task by the end of next year to develop a reliable benchmark for the money market interest rate, really based on actual transactions. And these are those transactions which I mentioned 2 minutes ago, these 45,000 transactions. Out of those who really affect a specific market, namely the unsecured market, from those we will compute from the end of next year on a daily benchmark interest rate, where most contracts in Europe, then financial contracts, will be linked to. So this is a completely new area, how to use the power of statistics for an important benchmark. So the challenge here, as we move now into this world of granular data, is that we have now, instead of a few aggregates coming from the countries, from the national central banks, which I mentioned before, now we get millions of records which come again through the national central banks, but they end up here, 50 million loans, for instance. Now this you can only compute with very powerful IT systems, and quality control you no longer can do by a smart analyst. You have to develop algorithmic driven quality controls. So we need an industrial production process, and for that, absolutely crucial is standardization, that you standardize, for instance, initiatives like the legal entity identifier is very much supported by the ECB because it's very crucial standardization, unique trade identifiers, unique product identifiers. So anything that standardizes and then makes industrial production of statistics possible is very, very crucial. And last but not least, you also need new skills, because if you're a more traditional, very good statistician working with macroeconomic statistics production, you know the European system accounts, you know the system of national accounts, you know the balance of payments manual. It's a different skills you need now when we move into an area of quasi big data, of where you have millions of loans or 45,000 transactions a day. when you have to work with those, you have to work with algorithms, you have to work with machine learning. So these are the new skills where we are starting to hire staff. I just signed three new staff which are strong in exactly this area and these skills which we now need. So what is now crucial with all this granular information, what the analysts really now want, how can I combine this? I don't want to look at all these different statistics or data individually anymore. I want to combine it. If I have a specific bank, for instance, I want to combine all information on that bank. Or if I have a specific sector in a country, what different information can I combine? And can I combine it? So this question of integration of granular data is something which gives us now a lot of challenges. I don't want to say headaches, but it gives us a lot of challenges, and we are working on this very, very much. But in order to combine different data sets, you have to be consistent in the concepts, in the definitions, in the metadata, and that is something we are working very hard on, because traditionally we developed statistics, and new statistics was developed because users wanted it, and we didn't pay so much attention whether the same expressions in this collection and in another collection really means the same thing. But this is now very, very crucial. So consistency dictionaries, as we call it, are becoming very, very important, so that you really can combine different data sets to a unique information set for the decision makers. And last but not least, we said it, as I mentioned it several times, we're not only producing for decision makers, we also put as much as possible at the disposal of the public. And our main workhorse of dissemination is our statistical data warehouse, which is on the internet, the so-called SDW, which currently has about 1.5 million data sets, which are accessible to the general public. And the internal is obviously a little bit larger, has about 7 million data sets. But we also try now with simpler approaches, because the statistical data warehouse, you have to be a knowledgeable user because there's so much information in there. We also try with other, like an app with our, we have also a specific homepage which is called Our Statistics, where you can compare different countries. So we also try with easier possibilities to give access to the general public on our information. So, but this is all information which is available to you, and I very much encourage you to look into our homepage and look into our data. In addition, we have a statistical paper series where we have now already 26 publications, where we also describe new approaches to statistics or interesting aspects of statistical methodology, or even little like sometimes reports of working groups on specific statistics. So we are also trying not just to produce the numbers, but also give information a little bit on the background of our work, and that is the so-called statistical paper series. Again, something you can download from our homepage. So that is basically in a nutshell and in a very fast time what I wanted to say about the second European statistical system, namely the system of national central banks. And as you see, it is very much developing. It is very dynamic, and every day we are facing new challenges. But it is a very extremely interesting area to work in, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Aurel. We'll just take a second to stop and restart recording. Now, some questions already appeared during your talk, so I will try to combine them a little bit, and I invite you to pose more questions in the chat box. So one question, because we already heard a lot about harmonization. There was a question: how do you validate the harmonized statistics? So how do you make sure that they are containing the information, the useful information, the correct information for decision making?
Good, as I say, again, this is a task of the whole system. So we are all in there, and the chain is as strong as the weakest link. So we very much, again, we harmonize first, we agree on what we want, that we all do it. And then you have all kinds of quality controls. You have at the national level, the national central banks have the task control the quality of the data they get reported from their respective banks or insurance corporation investment funds. So they are in close contact with their reporting agents, and we also do a lot in terms of information. So to prepare the reporting agents for the delivery of the data. So we rely very much then on national central banks to do their work. And once we get the national data, then as I mentioned, we do the cross-country comparisons. And whenever we find something that looks strange, unusual, so we have all kinds of algorithms that look at the data, that gives us indication or something looks strange, then we call up, then we talk, then they check back or they reconfirm. So tomorrow we publish our monthly interest rate statistics. Almost every month there is one or the other interest rate which moves in one country differently from other countries. Then there is a conversation with the central bank, and then usually it's confirmed, yes, there were 3 banks who had a special offer with cheap interest rates last month, and that influenced the numbers. So there is a lot of, we invest a very lot into quality, and luckily all those scandals and data scandals you heard about, fortunately, came not from our side. So I think we are pretty good on the quality. And then, for instance, in the supervisor data area, the data has to be submitted by XBRL. You have already within XBRL, if you have many plausibility checks, so if the data doesn't fulfill those plausibility checks, it's immediately rejected. It's only accepted if those checks are not failed. And so again, I don't want to say the data is perfect, but we spend a lot of effort into it. And for instance, the supervisor banking data, it is a main focus for this year is even further improving the data quality, because we still see after 3 years some heterogeneity in the quality of the data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, a different question was, do you involve in some way data from online commerce in your statistics?
No, yeah, good. I mean, online commerce is let's say now a real sector phenomenon. So I'm sure that the statistical institutes who compute the data on GDP, on consumption, etc., they have now new methods. So for us, for the data which we collect, online commerce of I don't know, Amazons, etc., is not really for us an issue, but for the national statistical institutes.
Okay. Now another question asked about estimation of informal and black market. How does ECB treat these gray zones?
Now again, I mean, informal sector, black market, again, we are on the real side, real economy side. So there we fully rely on the expertise, the judgment, and the data from the National Statistical Institutes or from Eurostat. So we don't question neither the inflation rate data or the GDP data for which we get from the National Statistical Institutes. Now, on the financial side, I mean, there we have more the challenge that new institutions are coming up. You might have heard about the shadow banking sector, which is nothing shadowy. It means institutions which are outside of the normal regulatory framework, which are not banks per se, but other financial institutions. And there we have to be always very, very attentive to this phenomenon and see if this is really a phenomenon which is getting important enough that it affects the relevance of our data, because at the bottom line is whatever we collect has to be relevant for decision making. So if the business moves from banks to non-bank financial institutions and we only collect data on banks, then we are not relevant for decision making anymore. So we have to be very attentive, and that's why we're enlarging also the scope, and that's why now we include pension funds, insurance corporations, financial vehicles corporations engaged in securitization, etc. So we are spending a lot of effort also really covering the whole relevant financial sector.
Okay. Do you also collect any data on these new, let's say, platforms for collecting money, like for the business sector, or cryptocurrencies are very a hot topic nowadays?
No, good. The questions like cryptocurrencies, fintechs, they are being observed, they are being looked at. But for instance, most of the fintechs currently, they are just somewhere in the value chain of payment systems. So it's so then not necessarily. Now we will start to collect payment system statistics after based on the PSD2 regulation of the EU. There, any payment service provider will have to provide data. So in that sense, yes. Otherwise, anybody who has a banking license, whatever they call themselves, but if they have a banking license because they need it for the business they do, they need a banking license, we cover those. The cryptocurrencies we are observing, fortunately, the overall volume, although you read so much in the newspapers, if you look at the volumes, they are still minimal. So we are talking about like 300 billion euros in the whole world. And our M3 is, I think, 5 to 7,000 billion euros. So we are still talking about a relatively small phenomenon.
Okay. Now one question from Sophia. You mentioned some standards for system of national accounts. Which are the main statistical standards for quality assurance for ECB?
No, as I mentioned, the Bible, so to speak, for us, for macroeconomic statistics, is the European system of accounts. So the system of national accounts, which is a UN standard, in Europe, it is a legal act, right? Because in Europe, the European system of accounts is also used for administrative purposes. You might have heard about the EDP, the excessive deficit procedure. So if a country has a budget deficit more than 3%, then there is a administrative procedure which can lead even to sanctions. But how do you compute the 3%? The 3% is taken from the European system of accounts, where you have the clear definition of what is a budget deficit or what is the financing need of the government. So in that sense, this is the most important. For balance of payments, for us, it's the balance of payments manual 6. So about a year and a half ago, we changed from the old ESA to the ESA 2010, and we changed to the BPM 6 in all countries in a harmonized way under the guidance and observance of the ECB. So these are the most important macroeconomic standards. Now, in the granular data, there are also market standards for granular data, the ISO standards. So I mentioned, for instance, our money market statistical regulation. So what we collect there is based on an ISO standard. And there, where there is not an ISO standard, we created an ISO standard for certain reporting cells, so to speak. And that was then made an ISO standard. So we try to use wherever there are standards, we follow those standards. But the most important on the macro side is ESA 2010 and BPM 6, and then for foreign direct investment also partly the OECD rules.
Okay, now we have two related questions, so I will read out both. First, regarding to challenges, how could you guarantee confidentiality of granularity data? What will be the most disaggregated level that will be published? And let's say related question, will introduction of GDPR impact existing exchange of information and corresponding IT systems and business processes?
Okay, now, as I mentioned, once you go to granular data, confidentiality is absolutely crucial. But again, for a central bank, I would say, even as statistics is very important, there are even more confidential data in a central bank. If you just think about all the liquidity bidding behavior of the banks day to day in getting central bank money, etc. So there is extremely confidential data already in the central bank in other areas. So for us, confidentiality is absolutely crucial, and we have both from the IT side, but also from our organizational side, everything that is standard, or even more than what is standard, to ensure confidentiality. And what is that only very, very few people have access, for instance. So we are clear access rules, who has access to what kind of information, what's the need to know for the person to have. So here we have very, very developed systems. Now, how granular are we going to publish? We're definitely not going to publish anything on an individual level. We haven't yet decided yet, for instance, for unaccredited, for the loans, how what sub-aggregates or aggregates are we going to publish. Now for the money market, we started, I don't remember now, 3 months ago, I think it was, when I had a press briefing where we started to publish money market data. Again, it's pretty much aggregated, or our supervisory data, which we started 2 years ago. Again, we don't publish individual bank data, we aggregate, but then we split it by country, we split it by business model, we split it by big banks versus small banks. So we give it more granularity, but again, it's always the principle that there should nobody can be identified. So you have to. We don't publish anything where you have less than 3 reporting agents, and even within the 3, if there is 1 or 2 together having more than 85%. So we are very, very strict in this. On the GDPR, I mean, we can say that we are not really affected because we don't have individuals as data on individuals, on human beings. Even for unaccredited, we will only get loans by companies, by non-financial corporations. We could not, although our users wanted, potentially also have loans by individuals like mortgages, but that was politically not feasible. So we did not pursue this any further. It might be in a few years' time, because in the meantime, the question of mortgages and the risks in the mortgage market is getting a bigger, more important question. So currently, we as statistics are not really affected. As ECB in general, we are obviously affected because there's a lot of areas where you have personal information on employees, etc. And we have somebody who is in charge of the GDPR data protection officer we have in the ECB. Yeah.
Okay. Another one, how is the supervision on the micro and macro prudential policies active? Are you working with the BIS in order to provide updated info for the monitoring report?
Nice. If I understand it correctly, man, on the as I said, for the macro prudential purpose, in general, we use all information that is available. So yes, also information which we get from the BIS banking statistics is obviously also relevant, and we use IMF information. We use many information which we put at the disposal of our users for the different purposes. On the micro supervisory, where we only in banking supervision, I mean, we collect all the data, the so-called ITS, as implementing technical standard data, so which is the COREP and FINREP data for the banks. We collect it, we do all these quality controls, and then put it at the disposal of our supervisory colleagues, and then we are in very close interaction with our supervisory colleagues if we detect any quality issues, any anomalies in the data. And we are also very much in contact if they have new data needs, because we have, outside of this core FINREP collection, we also have sometimes ad hoc collections of data, of information to specific issues that have been that arise. Yeah.
Okay, now one more question. Probably this will be the last one. If you want to add something, what about fintechs? Are they relevant?
No, I think I tried that before, addressed it briefly. So I mean, we have colleagues in the bank who observe the fintechs, but again, as I said, mainly they are currently in the payments area. So it's the colleagues from the payments systems department who are observing the fintechs. And now with the payments statistics which we collect from next year on, fintechs which are involved in payment services, payments initiation, etc., they will be part of the collection of the system. If fintechs really take loans on their books, then they become a bank. So they are in Germany, one or the other. I don't want to mention any names now, which are so kind of the startup banks, the new kind of banks. But at the end of the day, they are banks, and so they have a banking license, and they are subject to all the normal bank reporting like any bank.
Okay.
But if there are new developments, obviously we are observing and then seeing, is it relevant for our purposes for decision making? Then we have to make, and then we are back to what I said. We need a legal act.
Okay.
But then we address it.
Okay, I think that we now answered all questions. Many thank yous already coming in, and I would like to thank you myself for this excellent lecture and discussion. And special thanks to all our participants who joined us today from so many different places. Uh, if you wish to download the presentation, please stay with us for another minute or so. In the meantime, I'd kindly ask you to check your inboxes for a link to a very short survey about today's webinar. We'd really appreciate your feedback to further improve our webinars. The next webinar is scheduled for the next Wednesday already, the 7th of February, when our colleagues from the University of Ljubljana, Vasja Vehovar and Nate Berzelak, will be presenting basics of web surveys. Now we'll leave the room open for another 10 or 15 minutes and we'll publish the link to the recording by the end of the week on the website where you also registered for the webinar. So we'll now switch to the file for download. Thank you all for now and have a nice evening. Thank you, Aurel, once more.
Thank you for your interest. Thank you for
Bye-bye
your
to
interest.
Frankfurt.
Bye bye. Bye bye.